Come, traveler, and sit, and I will tell you of a time long past, an age of heroes and YouTube videos. When last we spoke, I told you of a time when barbarians ruled the fantasy genre, and of great artists who put their mighty visages to paper and canvas. And tales of these mighty barbarians and their great deeds were recorded in comic books throughout the time period. And how we all fought with these warriors in deeds of great heroism and valor in arcades and living rooms across the land. And of how the skalds sang songs and entertained those who sat at the great halls of 1980s movie theaters. And the bards sang how the images of these warriors were even painted onto the sides of rocking mounts. And finally, how these warriors even ruled Saturday mornings, a time that the gods themselves set aside for in which the young ones could rule themselves. And how into this world came He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe, to trample the lesser toy lines beneath his leathered boot. But he would not be alone, and soon the early 1980s toy shelves would be overrun by hordes of barbarian fantasy warriors. A new day had dawned, but this time could not last forever, and the fires of war began to burn low. The day of the barbarian toy was waning, and soon the barbarian toy would give way to a new type of warrior, one who mixed martial prowess with the traits of the animals of the wilderness. We begin this story in the distant year of 1985. That is where we will begin this adventure.
Hear the roar!
By 1985, the barbarian toy lines were beginning to wane. The larger lines, such as Masters of the Universe, still had a few good years left in them, but new competitors were starting to appear in toy aisles and children's toy boxes. The new fantasy or sword and sorcery toy lines began to move away from that barbarian aesthetic, and they often merged the warrior with animal traits or powers, as well as adding even more science fiction elements such as guns and spaceships. And the real winner or breakout toy line of this new wave of fantasy toy lines was LJN's Thundercats, with which we will start this journey. While Thundercats was a big line of toys and associated products, it began its life as an afternoon cartoon by that holiday animation giant Rankin Bass. The story revolved around a group of cat people who found themselves on a distant planet and embattled by their old animal-men hybrid enemies and a new undead enemy that was also found on that planet. The Thundercats still borrowed heavily from that earlier barbarian aesthetic, and it still featured scantily clad warriors with heavily muscled frames. But in addition to the medieval weapons and magic, this series placed an even heavier emphasis on sci-fi technology, including tanks, lasers, and flying machines. But the main hero, Lion-O, was far from a barbarian warrior. In fact, he was a young man in a grown man's body, and most of the stories revolved around Lion-O learning how to control his newly developed powers, as well as learn how to effectively lead this small band of cat people survivors. And on a personal note, while I always liked the show and the toys, there was one thing that bothered me about Lion-O. He just looked too much like Ronald McDonald. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. Anyway, let's take a look at the toy line that would give Masters of the Universe a run for its money, and ultimately see it placed on the warrior's pyre and set adrift like the kings of old. The toy line was released along with the cartoon in 1985. It began its life as a relatively humble affair with 8 action figures on a generally Masters of the Universe scale, perhaps slightly larger, and with some variation, and also 3 vehicles. The most important figure in the line was Lion-O, who was taller than the rest of the Thundercat action figures. He sported the LJN Battle-Matic action, where a lever on his back made him swing his sword arm up and down, and an even stranger gimmick. When a battery-powered ring was touched to a certain spot on his back, Lion-O's eyes would light up. The figure came with the magic Sword of Omens and a clawed glove that functioned like a shield. The Thundercats line featured some of the best accessories of any fantasy toy line of the 1980s. The next action figure was Panthro, who was both the mechanic and the muscle of the Thundercats. He was generally the same size as a Masters of the Universe action figure, and featured basically the same pose. He came with nunchucks adorned with claws, yet another great accessory, which he could also swing with his Battle-Matic action. And there was Tigra, the Thundercats' illusionist and stealth warrior. He came with a double whip-like weapon, a sort of Cat-O'-9 tails. Cat-O'-2 tails. Anyway, the whip seemed to mostly aid him with his stealth, illusion, and magic abilities in the cartoon. And finally there was Cheetara, the female of the group who was super fast and an acrobat. Like many acrobat-type characters of that time, she came with a staff. Cheetara is pictured here with a PVC figurine of the character Wily Kit. A short time into the toy run, some of the smaller Thundercat characters were offered as PVC figures along with certain full-sized articulated figures. But the Thundercats needed some foes to fight, and they got the evil mutants. In many ways, the mutants were just building on that human-creature hybrid setup by action figure lines such as Mattel's Masters of the Universe and supplemental toy lines such as Remco's Warrior Beasts. We'll start with Mum-Ra, who was their evil mummy-like leader, and like Lion-O, he stood taller than the rest of the action figures in the line. He came with a large black-bladed scimitar and a flamberge-like dagger, as well as a helmet with 2 snakes on the top and a battery-powered ring to make his eyes glow red. He really was a cool action figure. Next in line was the smaller but well-detailed Slithe action figure. The half-man, half-lizard came with a large halberd. These figures were really well detailed for the time and certainly outperformed the Masters of the Universe figures in the mold department. The Evil Monkeyan was the Thundercats' answer to the Masters of the Universe's Beastman, and he came with a helmet and a ball and chain weapon. The ball and chain weapon was once again one of the best weapons ever offered with an action figure during this time period. And finally, Jackalman, who came with a removable pauldron and a big club. And with the initial wave of Thundercats toys, LJN released several vehicles. The first and most important was the Thundertake, which became one of the most infamous vehicle toys of that era. It was featured heavily in the show, and almost became a character in and of itself. Meanwhile, the Evil Mutants received 2 smaller vehicle toys, both cast in the customary black and red or yellow to denote their bad guy ship status. The Thundercats would expand the toy line with several more waves of figures, vehicles, and playsets throughout the next few years. It was the next big craze, and was nearly as successful as Masters of the Universe. It was the first and most popular of the new wave of fantasy toy lines, and helped usher in a whole new era of sword and sorcery toys. But Thundercats was only the beginning, and the next big fantasy toy line was right around the corner. In fact, it was released the same year as the Thundercats. Sectaurs, the Warriors of Symbion. Sectars was produced by the company Coleco, who was known for their ColecoVision game system and nearly causing societal collapse with their Cabbage Patch dolls. This was probably in the forefront of their minds when they created the post-apocalyptic world of the Sectars. The Sectars was a toy line of 6-inch articulated part man, part insect warriors who existed in a post-apocalyptic world populated by many giant and fantastical insect and arachnid species, some of whom were telepathically bonded to the Sectar warriors. The most deluxe figures in the line came with large insect or arachnid mounts. These mounts were incredible, with some featuring battery-powered transparent wings that flapped, but all of them were effectively hand puppets, so that the kids' fingers served as the mount's insectoid legs. It was a fabulous concept. And as with most 1980s toy lines, the figures were broken into the forces of light and good, and darkness and evil. The figures were generally about 6 inches tall and came with an assortment of weapons and accessories. As seen here, the story of the Sectars had them on the planet Symbian, after a terrible scientific experiment has gone awry, wiping out the old technologically advanced civilization and resulting in a world ruled by insect-derived mutants, all fighting for survival. The lower price point figures did not come with a mount, but they still came with a small insect pet that had a unique play action, such as snapping jaws, flapping wings, or squirting water. The world building in Sectars was actually pretty complex, and the packages for the mounts included a hexagonal map that showed the features and locations around a small portion of the world of Symbian. It helped that the hexagonal map reminded many people of the maps used by Dungeons & Dragons at that time. This was an excellent toy line. The figures were well made and decently well articulated, and came with some great accessories. The biggest problem was that all of this detail seemed to create a much higher price point than their contemporaneous Thundercats or Masters of the Universe toy lines, and parents often had a hard time shelling out the big bucks for some bugs. Well, let's start by taking a look at the good guys, the forces of the Shining Realm.
Here's Johnny!
The primary hero of the toy line was the warrior prince Dargon. He came with a large mount named Dragonflyer, who featured battery-powered flapping wings and legs that actually were a glove for your hand to fit into. The large dragonfly sat on the top of the hand, while the hand itself acted as the toy insect's legs. The middle finger also operated the snapping jaws of the creature. It was a great-looking gimmick, and it was certainly a lot of fun. Dargon himself came with a sword and shield and 2 pistols that fit into holsters that could be belted onto the figure. He also came with a saddlebag for the dragonfly that featured a rifle. The full Dargon and Dragonflyer were amongst the most expensive of an already pricey toy line. So Coleco decided to offer a second version of Dargon called Night Fighting Dargon, with a smaller bug companion and a few less accessories. This Dargon was still pretty neat and came with a dagger and a pistol, 2 boot sheaths, and night vision goggles. The insect companion was Parafly, who could attach to Dargon's back and act as a kind of living jetpack. This version of Dargon had glowing antennas. And the other large and complex figure set for the heroic warriors was Pinsir, and his mount called Battle Beetle. Pinsir came with a large shield, a saber, an axe, and a pistol. Most of these could be held in a bandolier and a belt that came with the figure. The Battle Beetle mount used the same glove-as-legs interface that was featured with Dragonflyer, and the middle finger operated the clamping mechanism for the claws. Pinsir was a weapons expert and best friend to the blonde hero, and I think we've heard that one before. This was the Sectar's equivalent of Man-at-Arms. He even sported a dashing mustache. The next in line is Zack and his insect companion Bytor. Zack was one of the lower price point figures, but was still pretty great. He came with a pistol, a rifle that had a sling, and a shield. His companion Biter featured a button on his back that made his jaws snap. He was like a six-legged attack dog. And finally, we have the Sectaur's equivalent of Gandalf or Obi-Wan. Mantor was the wise and mystical mentor of Dargon, and he came with a molded crossbow, pistol, and shield. His eyes were colored purple instead of the standard good guy blue, denoting his mystical status, I guess. His buck companion featured an extendable grappling hook and string for Mantle to climb sheer surfaces. And that's going to wrap up our look at the Sectaurs included in the heroic Shining Realm side. So now let's take a look at the Sectaurs of the evil Dark Domain. We start with General Spidrax, who rode a giant flying spider with motorized wings. As with all the large mounts, the user's hand functions as the spider's hairy legs. The illusion is actually better with the hairy spiders than the more insect-like mounts of the Shining Realm. The next is actually my favorite of the bad guys. This is Skulk and his mount Trancula. The figure is the most inhuman and monstrous of all the Sectaurs, and the spider mount really looks great when using the glove legs to move it around. This is easily the creepiest and one of the coolest looking Sectaur toys. Skeeto was a mercenary working for the bad guys. He came with a shield, a pistol, and a saber. Think of Sectaur's version of Major Blood. His bug buddy Toxid could squirt water. Always a good feature on an 80s toy. And finally, there's Commander Waspax, a basic insect soldier of the Dark Domain who came with a pistol, sword, and a shield. His insect companion was a giant fly with a button on his back that made his opalescent wings flap, similar to Night fighting Dargon's Parafly. Waspax looked a lot like one of the Shining Realm warriors, but his red eyes gave him away. Well, that takes care of all the action figures, but what would an 80s toy line be if it didn't include a gigantic playset or fortress? So let me introduce the Hive playset, and this thing was truly massive, and in true Sectaurs fashion, it was jam-packed with monsters, features, and accessories. The playset had to be massive considering the 6-inch height of the figures. It was what Castle Grayskull was originally meant to be. It was a frightening ruin of lost technology, ancient magics, and layering beasts. Now this is what 1980s fantasy playsets were originally meant to be. It was scary, with dangers lurking around every corner, a haunted ruin in which survival was not guaranteed for good or evil. Probably the best part of the Hive playset was the puppets. There were two. One, a small finger puppet that looked like a caterpillar, and the other a large hairy spider that could lunge out of its lair and grab unsuspecting characters. Think of it as a mix between Shalob and that thing that came out of the hole and snatched that guy in Big Trouble in Little China. This is a gimmick which Masters of the Universe would employ the very same year when it released the Fright Zone playset, another great setting that could be used as a backdrop for dark adventures in dangerous places. Unfortunately, the Sectaurs could not compete with the flooded toy market, and the higher price point did little to help. One of the greatest sword and sorcery toy lines ever created quietly went into discount bins and faded from memory. Every Sectaur toy came with one mini-comic, a standard set by Masters of the Universe. These comics were actually produced by Marvel. And Marvel also produced a short Sectaurs comic series to help supplement the toys and the comics they came with. And that was not all. A cartoon series was created that aired in after-school time slots. But all of this was not enough. The planned second series of Sectaur toys was never released, and the cartoon also never reached a second season. Sectaurs gave us all this but still had more to offer. The Sectaurs toy line was knocked off and copied, resulting in some of the most infamous and incredible knockoff toys to ever be created. Perhaps these intrepid bugmen were the true heroes of the mid to late 1980s toy aisles. And so that takes us to our next toy series, another achievement in the world of Animal Men, Hasbro's Battle Beasts. In 1987, Hasbro went back to that font of popular and marketable Japanese toys, Takara. Takara had created the Battle Beast to go along with the Transformers toy line in Japan. They were called Beastformers, and they were introduced with the Japanese Headmasters line for the Transformers. They used the same gimmick that the Transformer rub sign stickers would employ, using heat-sensitive stickers on the figure's chest to reveal the figure's affiliation with one of three elements: water, fire, and wood. This would result in a paper, rock, scissors type game with another Battle Beast figure when deciding who could defeat who. Water beat fire, fire beat wood, and wood beat water by floating on it. The Battle Beast figure stood about 2 inches high and had 2 points of articulation just at the arms. Each figure came with a fantastic hand-to-hand combat type weapon, and they were molded to be clad in armor. Although the Battle Beasts were included in the Transformers storyline and universe in Japan, that was not the case in the United States, and the figures were given almost no backstory, personality traits, or even names. Why were they fighting? Who was good and who was bad? Where did they come from? Kids in the United States were left to make up their own details. And several vehicle toys were also produced to go with this toy line, including these 3 animal head-shaped chariots. You know, just like we run around in human head-shaped cars. There were also several more complex vehicles produced, including this shark-shaped vehicle and the beetle-shaped vehicle. Both of these converted to playsets, much in the same manner as those Micro Machine toys from the 1990s. You might be thinking, hey, little things, doesn't the link to the Transformers toy line in Japan make the Battle Beasts a sci-fi toy line and not a fantasy or sword and sorcery toy line? And to you, I say shut up. And possibly. But keep in mind that each figure was clad in armor, came with a hand-to-hand weapon, and in the United States we had no knowledge of their connection to the Transformer mythology. And although Battle Beasts had armor that kind of looked sci-fi, and vehicles that seemed like they might be technological, they were certainly not the only ones. While Thundercats, Sectars, and even Masters of the Universe contained some sci-fi elements, the next toy line released the same year continued to blur those aesthetic lines with a more comprehensive backstory. The Visionaries toy line by Hasbro, which was released in 1987. While not technically Manimals or Beastmen, the Visionaries did tap into Beast powers as a play gimmick. According to the official Visionaries story, the technology of the world ceased to exist, and magic once again became prolific, and became the primary means for powering vehicles and weapons. But the biggest innovation found in the Visionaries toy line was the use of holographic stickers. Each figure had a holographic sticker on his chest and another on a staff included with that figure. The stickers represented magic power. The hologram on the chest was the character's personality, and the sticker on the staff was a changing sticker, and it represented a totem that could be summoned for aid. The holographic stickers were a neat gimmick, and as usual, the toys were divided into 2 groups, the good Spectral Knights and the evil Darkling Lords. In addition to the totem staves, each figure came with a removable helmet and a hand-to-hand type weapon. The good Spectral Knights' weapons and staves were molded in silver-colored plastic, while the evil Darkling Lord's weapons were molded in gold-colored plastic. And 4 vehicles, 2 good and 2 evil, were produced for the line, all of which featured hologram stickers themselves, representing the magic that powered them and their weapons. Each of the vehicles came with an additional action figure, who also came with a weapon and a removable helmet. The Capture Chariot was one of the larger and more complex vehicles, and it came with the character called Feral. The other larger and more complex vehicle was the Dagger Assault. It was a vehicle of the evil Darkling Lords, and it came with the figure called Recon. And two smaller vehicles were also produced, the Lancer Cycle with Ektar and the Skyclaw with Mordred. And, like almost every other toy line of the 80s, a comic book line was produced to help kids flesh out the story. The Visionaries comic was produced by Marvel under the Star Comics label. And again, there was a cartoon series produced, but there seems to have been just too many of these toy lines crusading through the toy aisles at the time, and even a full product push was not enough to propel the toy line to the high standard of success that was set during this time period. The Visionaries were never given a second season or a second wave of toys. The Visionaries was not the only toy line to harness the magic of holograms in an attempt to sell an action figure line. The next toy line leaned even heavier into the gimmick. The same year that Hasbro's Visionaries were released, Tonka released the Supernaturals toy line. The Supernaturals were warriors that were sealed in a magic tomb that was actually a portal to the spirit world. Then, on Halloween, they escaped back into the mortal world to continue their ancient battle. There were two types of figures released for this line, the 6-inch articulated warrior action figures and the 4-inch ghostling figures, which we'll cover in a moment. There were 6 6-inch warrior action figures produced altogether, and each was quite different. The only articulation was at the hips and the shoulders. Each figure's torso was basically a hollowed out and flattened panel that featured a changing holographic sticker that, when looked at in one direction, was the character's humanoid face, but when looked at from another direction, changed to resemble their warrior spirit. Each warrior had a shield that featured a hologram sticker, and each one also included some really great glow-in-the-dark weapons. And once again, there were bad guys and there were good guys. The good guys were actually pretty neat for this line, and consisted of a knight in gold plate mail, an Indian warrior with a spear, and discount Thor. The Viking even featured separate flowing golden locks. It was like an angel and a pirate ghost had a baby. And where the good guys were pretty cool, the bad guys were even cooler. There was a zombie that transformed into a full skeleton, a wizard-looking guy who became a snake man, and a guy who turned into living flames. Perhaps this was the pinnacle of hologram sticker technology. As a people, we finally achieved that which the hologram sticker was meant for, what the creator of such stickers dreamed they could be: creepy ghost action figures. Yet there was still more to this line. Tonka created 8 smaller figures called Ghostlings. They stood about 4 inches tall, and each one came with a glow-in-the-dark sword. The Ghostlings were just molded plastic shells that resembled a cloak. The same mold was used for every Ghostling action figure, but the colors varied. One side of that plastic shell was sort of hollow, and into that hollow space was placed a changing hologram sticker. The sticker depicted whole human figures, which would change, by your perspective, into other creatures or monsters. Over that cloaked hologram was yet another rubber cloak that gave the Ghostling figures arms to hold their weapons. It was pure chaos. It made no sense. The holographic depiction may have been a magician that turned into a rabbit, or a pharaoh that became a mummy, but the whole thing was encased in a rubber cloak with an extra set of arms. What was going on here? The spirit world was no place for the fragile mortal psyche. And Tonka couldn't stop there. 2 tricked-out vehicles called Ghost Riders were also produced. The good Ghost Rider vehicle was called the Ghost Finder. And the evil Ghost Rider vehicle was called the Bat Bopper, a truly terrifying moniker.
These vehicles were obviously taking a hint from that 1960s and early 1970s trend of putting creepy ghouls into souped up and tricked out rides. In fact, the Ghost Finder is eerily similar to Ed Roth's Mr. Gasser. And like all the other 1980s toy lines, Tonka gave us a playset for these terrifying warriors from beyond. The Tomb of Doom was not very detailed, and was sparing in features and accessories, but made a great display panel for your ghostly denizens. Also, it looked just like the exterior of a spooky ride at a carnival. That's right, I just love comparing the aesthetics of 1980s sword and sorcery lines to spooky attractions from that same time period. I will never stop. There also seems to have been a particularly well-received scare-heavy comic in the UK, but I don't remember it on this side of the Atlantic. It seems to have borrowed heavily from older pulp horror comics. Well, there was no tie-in cartoon, and the Supernaturals, like so many other toy lines at this time, would never see a second series or a second wave of toys. They faded from the mortal world forever. And so we wrap up our look at the sword and sorcery toys from the mid to late 1980s. Not many of these... Wait a second.
Here comes a new challenger!
In this time of beastmen and sci-fi fantasy hybrids, two little-known filmmakers, George Lucas and Ron Howard, decided to throw out a little sword and sorcery spectacle called Willow. Willow had a pretty big rollout, with quite a few tie-in products and merchandise, and of course, there was a toy line. The toy line, produced by Tonka in 1988, was a bit different than most, as it consisted of smaller non-articulated figurines instead of the usual articulated action figures. Most of the figurines were offered in single packs, others came on mounts, and some were offered in multiple figure sets. Several vehicles or war machines were also created, but the best part was the two-headed dragon, Ebersisk, who was featured in a great sequence in the film. It is difficult to know why Tonka produced figurines instead of the customary articulated action figure. Perhaps they were trying to reach out to the D&D player in the tabletop fantasy gamer market, who often collected tiny metal miniatures of fantasy sword and sorcery adventurers. But to my knowledge, no game was released that utilized these Willow figurines. Sadly, perhaps foolishly, the movie was a financial disappointment, and the toys, for a myriad of reasons, quickly hit discount bins and faded into obscurity. Whether you liked the toy line or not, it was certainly interesting and is probably worth a closer look. And so now here, at the end of all things, we take our final look at the sword and sorcery and fantasy toys of the 1980s. The 1990s were just around the corner and everything was about to change. The cinematic world would shift forever with the release of Tim Burton's Batman in the summer of 1989, and the toy trend would certainly turn towards superheroes for the next couple of decades. But this was not the end of the Manimal. In fact, a new kind of Beastman was hiding in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. A toy that would change the toy industry forever, and a craze that would sweep the nation, making kids drop their knight and barbarian toys into toy box bottoms, not to see the light of day again until they were packaged and donated to the local Goodwill or sold at a yard sale. A new breed of Manimal that would shape the destiny of children for decades to come. The Mutant Turtle. Well, the age of the barbarian was over, but the age of the Manimal was only just beginning. We would continue to see the popularity of the man-beast hybrid throughout the 1990s, but the setting would change from general sword and sorcery to a more comic book and superhero aesthetic. This comic book phase of toys would rule the toy world throughout the 1990s and continue well into the 2000s, but that is another story. Thanks again for joining us into this journey into the wilds of the mid to late 1980s toys. Please hit the like button and subscribe to stay in touch with future content. There are many more lands through which we must journey, before we see all the little things that made us toy-craving beasts.